Welcome to this presentation covering performance appraisals, training, and development. So let's begin. In this presentation, we're going to discuss performance appraisals and also the topic of training and development. Under performance appraisals, we're going to discuss how a manager or someone in the HR department develops the criteria that is used to actually appraise a person, what that process ought to look like, and what the employee's role in that process is. And then we'll discuss the topic of some legally required or at least highly recommended training topics and how those trainees ought to be selected for those particular training topics. So let's begin. So as a general rule, there is no law that says that employees have to be appraised. There is no need to have an official program in order to comply with a particular law. That is true, certainly, but an employer that does not regularly and consistently and fairly appraise its employees is likely to find itself very vulnerable to discrimination claims, and also is going to find a workforce that is not very motivated and that is probably pretty detached from its managers in terms of what it thinks, the employees thinking what the expectations are versus what the managers really want. We're really cutting off the main area of communication regarding expectations and how to meet them. So it's highly, highly, highly recommended, not only for legal compliance purposes, but also just for the general success of the business. If an employer chooses to have a performance appraisal process, those are usually the linchpin, the central part of most, I won't say most, but certainly a very significant portion of discrimination claims. Performance appraisals are almost always the main pieces of evidence, unless you're talking about like a sexual harassment case where there's just very clear, serious wrongdoing. If you're firing somebody because they didn't do a good job over a period of time, the performance appraisals are going to be the documents that are going to be front and center in the case. So it's important to have an appraisal process, but it's important to have an appraisal process that is not discriminatory. And so whenever you are in a position where you're rolling out a program that is training folks how to do a performance appraisal process, it's not just a matter of telling folks, okay, this is what the system is, go do it, but also training them in all of our Title VII stuff that we've talked about and giving them the tools that they can, number one, avoid discriminatory comments and also create documents that are going to be good in front of that jury in the event that the matter does progress to a jury at some point. Things that we're looking for then are going to be things that are quantifiable, that are objective. So if Sally works in a job where she's in sales, then you want to compare her sales output with other salespeople's output in that particular department. So you may want to have data about how maybe how many sales she generated, maybe the absolute number, maybe the total sales volume that she's generated. If she happens to work, if the workforce tends to vary, some are working 20 hours a week, some are working 40 hours a week, then those numbers ought to be adjusted for the hours that are worked. If some hours of work are more profitable than others, for example, in a retail environment, Saturday shifts may generate many more sales than, say, Tuesday morning shifts. Well, that also ought to be adjusted for. Or alternatively, all the workers ought to have access to all the different time slots. So there's lots of important ways of looking at the data, thinking about the data, coming up with goals to evaluate Sally's performance compared to other people's performance. Because at the end of the day, if she's not carrying her weight in terms of sales, it doesn't matter what her gender is, or her race, or her religion, or her ethnicity, or her age. She's not being successful in the job, and that's an easy case for the employer to prove. Now, the reality is not all criteria is quantifiable. Let's say Sally has a bad attitude, but she's very productive at sales. Well, how do you quantify a bad attitude? Sally is all sweetness and light when she's dealing with customers, but she's unpleasant to her coworkers and she's unpleasant to management. Maybe she is always on time at work, but once she gets there, she's not doing the work that is needed to set up the particular sales area before the customers arrive. So you can't quantify everything, but even things like that, you can make notes in the file. For example, every time Sally or anyone, and it would be important to be consistent and not just single Sally out, or anyone you need to say, hey, Sally, or hey, Bob, that's not appropriate. We need to have a better attitude. That kind of language isn't appropriate. The roll of the eye isn't appropriate, whatever it is. And put that in some kind of day planner, some kind of calendar, so that you can say, I spoke to Sally 15 times about eye rolling over the course of the year. That's quantifiable. There was only 2 other associates I ever had to talk to about eye rolling. That was Bob, I talked to him twice, and Teresa, I talked to her once. Under those circumstances, you've made it pretty quantifiable. But the challenge, of course, here is the manager going to consistently record all of those incidents? And there's actually a few points along those lines. Number one, is the manager going to talk to Sally each time she eye rolls? And that a lot of times managers are like, oh, that's too much hassle. I don't want to do that. It's too unpleasant. But you have to do it. I mean, do you let one eye roll go by without talking and pulling Sally aside and talking to her? Perhaps. And you may pick the time that's helpful. That you don't want to do that at a time where there's lots of customers around or things along those lines. But what you might say is, Sally, I need to talk to you later. Please come by when you're not working with the customer. And then talk to Sally about whatever that issue might be. So you need to talk to her before you, or at the same time that you're documenting the issue. And you need to talk to her privately. You don't talk to an associate about or an employee about a disciplinary issue at the same time that other workers are there. You also need to give Sally the opportunity to respond. And it's a good idea to allow Sally some time to respond. And if something frustrating has just happened, to give her time to collect herself. And so to be respectful and responsible and give her that opportunity to put herself in the best light forward. When you have these conversations, you also need to approach it in a positive way. For example, something that you might say about this is, Sally, when we were on the sales floor, I saw that you rolled your eyes when I reminded everybody about the need to do X, Y, Z. That eye roll communicated to me that you were not supportive of what we were doing. I'd like to explain to you again why that's an important part of our puzzle. So hopefully I can get in buy-in from you, because I know that you're a great worker when you're committed to a project. And I want you to be very, very successful here. Your success is, frankly, my success. And so we're on the same side when we talk about this. But we need to do X, Y, Z. And I also need you to be a willing participant in X, Y, Z. So when you have this conversation, you need to make the standard clear. You need to make it clear that you notice the misconduct. You need to give compliments about things if those are appropriate. In most cases, you will have something positive that you can say. And then you also want to talk about, we're all on the same side together, where our goals are the same at the end of the day. On the other hand, if it's just an eye roll, you don't need it to be a 20-minute conversation. A 3-4-minute conversation may be all that's necessary. But Sally needs to know that she can't roll her eyes at you. That's not going to work here. And so you need to have that communication clear from probably, again, not saying you have to do the first time, but certainly if it continues after the second time, for example, you want to make sure that she's aware of the standards. And whenever you have any conversation with an employee, even if it's just something that's 30 seconds long, hey, don't do that again. You need to document it. Lots of different ways it can be documented. You can have one calendar that you just document it on. Maybe there's a page for every day. And under those circumstances, at the end of the appraisal period, or when a problem becomes more serious, then you're going to have to go through and find all the comments that you have about Sally versus Bob versus Teresa versus Alan, et cetera, et cetera. You will probably, if you have a workforce of 10 or 20 folks, you're probably going to have several comments over the course of the week. It ought not be the end of the world when an employee gets a comment from you. An employee should think, oh, I made a mistake, I'm going to get a comment. By having them pretty regularly, you diffuse the, oh my gosh, my boss just said something mean to me type attitude. They know that that's a regular part of working for you, that they are going to get comments from time to time because no one's perfect. And you can actually start your comment that way. Hey, nobody's perfect. Don't want to beat you up, but just to let you know, you were 2 minutes late today, and that's not going to work here. So be sure that that doesn't happen in the future. Thanks for all your hard work. Go out there and knock them dead. And that's the end of the comment at that point. So be sure that you do it regularly. And I think it's even a positive thing to, if you haven't had anything constructive feedback to give somebody in a week or two, look for something so that they know this is a regular part of working here. Everybody gets comments. Also, everybody gets praise. If you haven't praised a particular employee in a week or two, try to look for something to praise them. You want to, as a manager, constantly be giving feedback to that person in a respectful way, when it's negative, in a confidential way, but it ought to be a regular part of the workplace. And then you want to document it. Now, again, documenting all of these comments can become difficult to sort through it. So, one approach is to have the one book where you document everything, but maybe to highlight it in different colors. When you use a yellow highlighter when it's Bob's comments, you use a green highlighter when it's Sally's comments, you use a pink highlighter when it's Teresa's comments, whatever. But you may run out of colors before you get to all of them. So you might have, a regional, or let's say there's one page for May 17, but you have a section for Bob, a section for Sally, a section for Teresa. And, most days probably each one of those sections will be blank, but over the course of a week, you'll have it all filled in. Alternatively, maybe for a week, you could have a page for each one of them. And maybe it's your goal to have one positive and one negative thing to say about each one of your employees each week that you communicate to the employee. Of course, sometimes you may have more than one positive thing or more than one negative thing. And so you would have, for week 17 of the fiscal year, you have a page for Bob. And during that week, Bob, you gave him 3 compliments and you gave him 1 negative comment. Okay, that's all on one page. You note the date, you note the comment. If it's a negative comment, ideally you put it within a frame of reference. You explain what's going on. Probably your note taking is going to take longer than the time it takes to actually have that conversation with the employee. You're doing that too, because you're not going to remember exactly why. Let's say your comment to Bob was, Bob, you need to be a little bit more careful in your personal appearance. Well, you're going to want to explain, what was Bob wearing that you felt that was appropriate to say to him? His shirt tails were not tucked in, for example. Okay, that's what the problem is. And then you want to say what was said. So it's important for managers to routinely have these conversations with the employees. And these are oftentimes going to be informal. Obviously, if a problem continues to occur, then you're going to escalate it and you're going to go to a more formal process where you're actually writing out the comments and having the employee sign the comments. Now, as I said before, performance appraisals are not legally required, but if you have them, and you certainly should have them, it's certainly the legally smart path, you need to have everyone be appraised. You don't want to have one department that gets its regular appraisals and another department that doesn't. So in this sense, if you are, say, the senior manager in an area, or you're giving advice to the senior manager in the area, which is, I guess, more likely is in the role of paralegal, you want to make sure that all of your mid-level managers and all of your supervisors are conducting those appraisals. In fact, that ought to be an appraisal point in their appraisals. So, for example, let's say you have a supervisor over the widget department. Well, you want to have that appraisal, maybe a goal for that particular supervisor. Supervisor will complete well-written and objective appraisals of her 25 employees by June 17th. And that may be an annual performance goal for that particular employee. And so that employee is going to do it because it's on his or her goals to do it. And so that's one way. And if the employee doesn't do it, then you're going to pull that employee aside on June 17th and say, hey, Sally, Barbara, how are your appraisals going? Oh, I've done 15, but I've got 10 more to do. Okay, well, that needs to be a first priority. The goal was to have them all done at this particular time. You need to be sure to calendar these things and give yourself enough time to go it forward. Do you think you can get it all done in the next week? Yeah, I think I can. Two are on vacation, but other than those two, I think I can do it. Okay. Well, will you be able to get the two that are on vacation done next week? Should be able to. Okay, so that's our revised goal. Please be sure to accomplish that. That's the way to address that issue. And again, managers oftentimes need coaching in this area. You may be the person in the position to coach about how to set up the quantifiable goals and about how to touch base with the employees periodically to see that they are moving in that direction, and that when it comes time to talk about the goals, that the manager knows how to have that conversation both when the goals are satisfied and when the goals are not satisfied. I once worked in a company where we were the department that was responsible for doing the appraisals, or not doing the appraisals, but having the appraisal program set up. We didn't actually do them, but we wrote the guidance about how to do them. We trained people on how to do them. But this was a situation where the cobbler's children had no shoes. We did not get appraisals. We were the only department, I believe, in the entire company, and it was a large one, JCPenney, where we were not appraised. And so I went about 2 or 3 years without getting a single appraisal. The only way that our most senior boss was able to get away with it is that he was in charge of the whole appraisal program. And so he was the one who knew who wasn't being appraised or not. And if anybody in anyone but his department had employees who weren't being appraised, he would be very unhappy with them. But in his own department, we did not receive appraisals. We were a small department, maybe 10, 15 employees, but that's not an unusual thing, and it's not a good thing, obviously. And so you need to make sure that everyone in the organization is getting that type of review. Now, as the person in the legal department, if you work in the HR function legal department, you may have a similar role. To you as a paralegal may be responsible, for example, for making sure that all the appraisals come in and they're completed according to the company's requirements. It may also be that you're in the role to remind people about this importance or train people about how to do these things. And so it's important that it not just be sporadic or when people got the time to do it. It needs to be a consistent part of the annual appraisal. And some companies do it twice a year, which is not a bad thing. So negative appraisals, when people get appraised and they get glowing reviews, there's relatively little risk with those. I guess there is a risk if the person really isn't a good worker, but the manager, for whatever reason, gives them an unusually favorable appraisal. That does present some risks. I guess there's two with respect to that. One risk is that the employee may later on have a different manager who fairly appraises him or her. Well, now it looks like there may be some discrimination going on because this person was highly rated, manager changed, now they're more lower rated. That looks like perhaps the second manager is discriminating against that person on some basis, especially if the manager and the subordinate are of a different race or religion or sex or whatever, or age or whatever the category is. When in fact, the second manager may be the only one who's doing his job or her job of reasonably appraising the person. So that's one risk with giving an overly positive appraisal. The second risk with giving an overly positive appraisal is that if the manager is rating, that same manager who gave the overly positive appraisal is rating other subordinates in a fair way, in a consistent way, then if let's say one of the other employees who is rated fairly but negatively is dismissed because of his appraisal, well, that employee might file a charge of discrimination, and one of his or her comparators might be that highly rated person who didn't earn his high rating or her high rating. And so if there are quantifiable ways of comparing the performance, you can see how that may look like the one who was dismissed was being unfairly appraised, when in fact it was a person who was highly rated who was inconsistently appraised. So there are some risks associated with an overly positive appraisal, but let's be real, that's not where most of the risk is. Most of the risks are going to be in the negative performance appraisal situation. And so that's where there ought to be a focus. A good policy to recommend to your clients is that whenever somebody receives a negative performance appraisal, that there be at least one additional level of review. Most companies are going to have all of the appraisals have at least one higher level of review. So let's say you have an organization, let's do kind of an org chart here. So you have, we'll say each one of these sticks represents 5 employees. So you have a supervisor. So there's a total of 25 employees here and a supervisor. So we have 4 supervisors, and all of these 4 supervisors report to a manager. And so what would happen is that the supervisors would prepare the 25 appraisals for their subordinates, and then the manager would look at all 100 of the appraisals, looking to make sure, number one, there are no grammatical errors. Hopefully there wouldn't be that in these documents anyway, but sometimes people can miss those types of things. Make sure that the language in them is appropriate, and to make sure there's consistency. If you see that Supervisor 1 has rated all of his people, let's say this is a 5-point system. He's rated all his people 1s and 2s, the highest. But the other ones have much more balanced ratings. I mean, it's possible that Supervisor 1 just is blessed with really awesome employees. And certainly you should be open as the manager to that possibility. But more likely it is that Supervisor 1 is an easier grader. And so it's not unusual for a manager to say, okay, we'll need to have consistency across the ranks. We'll talk more about different systems for categorizing, but some employers will say, okay, we have a 5-point system. Each one of you have 25 workers. None of y'all can have more than 5 1s, no more than, say, 7 2s, no more than, we'll say 10 3s. That gets us to 22. And the 4s and 5s would be the remaining 3. You need to have 3 at least that are 4s and 5s. I mean, I'm just making up numbers here. You could come up with a different system. And this way, it's going to force Supervisor 1 to be more balanced in his or her appraisal. Now, a worker might say, Supervisor 3 might say, I don't have 5s that are 1s. I have 3 that are 1s. So then in that situation, if a person says they only have 3 that meet this criteria, then they could have 9 that are 2s. So the system, can allow some flexibility down, but not flexibility up. And so the manager is in a position to kind of balance out the ratings to make sure they're written appropriately, and also to make sure that the rating system is reasonable. Obviously, the manager should know most of the 100 workers, but he obviously or she is not going to be in a position to know all of the workers very well and not to know the details of the work performance. So the manager can't replace the supervisor with respect to all of these goals, but having that level of review can be great and important in order to develop consistency, in order to ferret out any kind of discrimination. Another thing the manager is looking for is, wait a second, all of the employee, your workforce is balanced, Bob, but I noticed that all of the workers who you're giving 4s and 5s to are African American. That doesn't seem statistically likely. Can you tell me why you thought that they were the poorest performers? I also noticed that their sales numbers were very average. They were not especially bad. And some of the Caucasian and Hispanic workers who you rated as 3s actually had lower productivity than some of the African Americans you rated as 4s or 5s. So the manager also can identify maybe unconscious bias on the part of supervisors. If the manager doesn't have enough time to evaluate the positive performance appraisals, he or she definitely ought to evaluate those that are kind of below the acceptable rating. And oftentimes employers will have 2 levels below the acceptable rating. One level is kind of improvement needed. You're not about to be fired, but the trajectory here is not looking good, basically, is what you're saying here. Usually the lowest appraisal is for immediate dismissal. This person has done something that is just kind of unforgivable. They've stolen, they've falsified a document, something along those lines. And so that performance appraisal in some sense kind of never is used, because you don't praise somebody. You just give them a reason for dismissal and let them leave. But essentially, that is the appraisal. And so you're probably not waiting for that final appraisal meeting to dismiss someone. Obviously, if they're stealing from you on May 1st and you know it, you're not going to wait to the performance appraisal on June 17th to actually complete the dismissal, because then you've just given them 40, 50 more days to steal from you. So that's not a good idea. Obviously, if we have biased negative appraisals, in other words, somebody is receiving a lower appraisal simply because he or she is a woman or a man or a African American or an older person or whatever the criteria is, obviously it would be very unusual to have a supervisor actually state that I'm giving you a lower appraisal because you're a woman. They're just not going to do that. Even if that's the reason that they're doing it, they're not going to say that. They're going to come up with something. And probably they're going to largely believe the reason they came up with it. I mean, yes, there are some people who in their heart of hearts are just flat out racist and just don't like people who are racist or sexist or whatever, just don't like people different than themselves. But most of the time, people don't think of themselves in those terms. They have unconscious biases, and that is what is forming their view. And so when they see, say, an African American employee, and they are more inclined to see performance weaknesses. When they see the Asian employee, they're more likely to see performance strengths. And so that results in a worse appraisal for the African American, even though overall the performance level of the 2 workers may be about the same. So the unconscious biases is one of the things that the manager ought to be looking to root out. And that's one of the things that ought to be a source of training for the manager. If you are responsible for it, the manager ought to know which one of these workers is African American, which one of these workers is Arab, which one of these workers is Asian, which one of these workers is, all of the variety of characteristics, so that that manager can be on the lookout for inconsistencies in appraisal ratings. So again, these negative appraisals would be something that would be very useful in a disparate treatment discrimination case. Again, that's different than disparate impact. Disparate treatment is when I'm being discriminated against because I'm a woman. Unwarranted negative performance appraisals could constitute materially adverse actions. Again, the type of thing that could result in discrimination claim. In cases of retaliation, so obviously retaliation is another category under Title VII. When I complain about sexism, for example, even though maybe I was wrong, maybe there wasn't any sexism, but I complain about it and now I'm getting even worse treatment. Well, maybe I was wrong about being a victim of sex discrimination, but I may be right about being the victim of retaliation. And so obviously you can't use negative performance appraisals to retaliate against a worker, even if you don't think their initial claim was meritorious. Keep this in mind, because as you're working with your managers and supervisors, the employees are often savvy. And if they think, oh, my manager said a lot of negative comments to me, my sales are down, I've had a lot of targets, whatever the criteria is that they're concerned about, they may start thinking, oh, I don't want to get a bad appraisal, because if I get a bad appraisal and there's a layoff, I'm going to be on the short list. How can I reduce my chances of getting a bad appraisal? Well, they may think to themselves, I'm going to file a claim sometime. Because if I file a claim, up until this point, in previous years, I've had decent appraisals. Again, we'll say it's a 5-point system. I've had 2s and 3s. Not great, but fine. But I think I'm going to get a 4 this time, just because how many criticisms I've gotten. Well, I'm going to make a claim about a month before my appraisal, so that if they do give me a 4, I can say, this is retaliation. Well, one of the responses that the employer is going to be able to have is the employer is still going to be able to say, well, let's compare. We'll say this is Sally who's done this. Let's compare Sally's performance with all the other people in the department. And again, if most of the appraisal is objective, quantifiable measurements, and Sally's numbers are worse than those who got 1s, 2s, and 3s, then there is no retaliation. If they are more subjective characteristics, the supervisor who is appraising Sally can pull out his or her day planner and say, oh, well, look, I talked to Sally 10 times this year about having a poor attitude on this date, this date, this date. And you can see that 9 of the 10 times happened before her complaint. So you can see how the retaliation claim is now significantly weaker. Now, those comments have to be contemporaneously written in the notebook, and so you want to make sure that it's not something that's an after created document. But those comments can be very, very powerful to undermine the possible retaliation claim or even discrimination claim in that negative appraisal. And in a way, having those records moves what might be somewhat subjective judgments into the more objective, quantifiable category, because you can say, I saw 10 instances of unhelpful conduct, and I documented them, and I talked to Sally about those things. Sally might say, well, Susan had equally unhelpful conduct on a regular basis, but you never talked to her. And so it's not like you're necessarily as a supervisor guaranteed that that's going to necessarily save the day, but it's certainly a positive way of removing some of the subjectivity to some of the more difficult to evaluate aspects of performance. So why do we care about performance appraisals? Why do we as the manager or the HR department care about them? Why does the employee care about them? Well, they lead to good stuff or bad stuff. They lead to promotions if they're good. They lead to raises if they're good. They lead to dismissal if they're bad. They may lead to development opportunities if they're good. They may lead to training opportunities if they're not so good, but also good. So there's lots at stake in the performance appraisal system. And so when you're training your managers to do this, you need them to understand the stakes that are involved. This is not something just you check off, okay, I did the appraisals, checked it off. No, this is establishing people's trajectory for their careers. This is establishing how motivated they are for the next year. Both carrots and sticks can be powerful motivators in the workplace, and a smart appraisals are going to include both carrots and sticks. And so here's an important aspect to keep in mind. The courts are not, let's say a matter does go into litigation, the court is not going to sit back and say, well, we disagree. We think Sally's performance deserved a 3 instead of a 4. That's not the court's job to second guess the manager, the supervisor. Instead, the issue is going to be, do we believe that the appraisal was discriminatory or retaliatory or had some unlawful motive? So, for example, if I am the supervisor and I rate all of my employees especially harshly, and so people who otherwise would have gotten a 1 get a 3 from me, and people who ordinarily would have gotten a 2 get a 4 from me. That's not discriminatory if I'm consistent. The court and the jury may well say, she's a tough grader. Oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. But as long as I'm consistently tough, there's no discrimination. And so the issue is whether there was discrimination. So how these are written are really important. It's not just the number, it's how things are written. So one way to reduce the possibility of court finding discriminatory intent is to make sure that appraisals include reasonable praise when it's appropriate. Almost all workers are going to have some positive things you can say about them. If nothing else, maybe Bob comes to work on time and you can make a comment about that, even if his work quality is very poor. So look for something, or you train your managers to look for something positive to include in appraisals, at least something. And oftentimes there's going to be more than one thing that you can add to an appraisal to make it positive. You also should look for some constructive criticism. No worker is perfect, and so that ought to balance it out. So if when the court looks at all the appraisals, the court can say, wait a second, even the person who's supposedly the favorite, who's also of the same ethnicity as the supervisor, even that person receives some constructive feedback. Jason's workstation isn't as neat as it should be. For example, that might be a relatively trivial negative comment, and everything else may be very, very positive. But that again helps the court say, wait a second, the supervisor gives praise and critique to all of his or her employees. And again, that reduces the chances of the documents seeming to be discriminatory. So here are some of the things that most of performance appraisals are going to include. One is the work quality and quantity. Again, sometimes this is going to be easy to make in a very objective way. If my job is to assemble widgets, the number of widgets I assemble per hour is going to be my quantity, and the amounts that are rejected by the quality department is going to be my quality. And so sometimes it's very easy, but for many jobs, there won't be those easy criteria. So for example, at you in your paralegal position, there won't be an easy way for your manager to say, well, Bob answered, 40 interrogatories today or whatever. Well, I mean, sometimes to answer 40 interrogatories might be something you could do in an hour, maybe not an hour, but a morning. Another set of 40 interrogatories might take you 2 weeks to do. They're not necessarily fungible or involving the same amount of work. And so it can be difficult to calibrate. Now, since a paralegal bills her time, the quantity, you could say, well, Bob bills only 17 hours a week on average. Susan bills 30 hours a week on average. So in terms of quantity, you could say that Susan is doing better than Bob is. But let's say you have to write off half of Susan's time. So really, Susan's only really billing 15 hours of her time. Whereas Bob is billing 17, you never have to write off any of his time. So his quality of work is significantly better than Susan's quality of work. So in most jobs, there's going to be some things that can be quantified, but there will be other important aspects that can't be quantified. If you're going to make a negative comment about the quantity or quality of work, a couple of things. First of all, you need to have those comments that you can refer to. I talked to Bob on this day, this day, this day about the fact that he had too many typos in his documents, or that his documents lacked sufficient research, or whatever the issue might be. So you need to have those documented in your folder, and you need to have documented that you have these conversations with Bob. Anything negative in a performance appraisal should be completely not a surprise to the employee. If you haven't said that to that employee at least 3 times over the course of the year, it doesn't belong in the performance appraisal. So the employee ought to be able to think, oh, my boss has told me several times that my office is too messy. I know I'm going to see that in my performance appraisal. Or the boss has told me several times that I need to watch my typos. I can expect to see that on my performance appraisal. There should be no surprises in terms of negative comments. I suppose you could have positive comments be surprises, but even there, you don't want to wait to make the positive comments until the performance appraisal, because that person's been doing good work for you for a year and you haven't acknowledged that fact. And so that's not a good thing either. Attendance and punctuality should be part of the appraisal process, especially when it's a problem or when it's a job where this is considered a really important aspect. For example, it's important to have your receptionist show up to work on time, because if he or she's not there, who's going to greet people coming into the office? Or if you're working on an assembly line and you're not there punctually, who's going to do your workstation during that period of time? But there are other jobs where it's much less important that you be punctual. If my job is to write articles for the newspaper, it may not be important. Let's say my articles, it's not that I have to produce an article every hour, but my article output is measured on a weekly or monthly basis. It may not be that important that I come to a particular time. Maybe I, might work from home even and do the work, or maybe I'm a night owl and I do a lot of my work at night. So it's good. So the importance of attendance and punctuality is going to vary from job to job. If you aren't documenting that for some people, but you are for other people, then it's a good idea to include a comment that explains why you're documenting it for some and others. So for example, let's say Sally is the receptionist. It's important she be at work exactly at 8 a.m. to greet people coming into the business. Ted, his work is not time sensitive in that sense. And, if he comes in at 8:30, that's okay. If he comes in at 9, that's okay. Well, and let's say Sally isn't coming to work consistently on time, but maybe she's coming in before Ted. So in her mind, she's doing just fine, because look at Ted, he comes in after her. Well, when the comments to Sally are shared, and Sally raises the issue of Ted, it ought to be explained to her that, first of all, I'm not going to discuss Ted's situation, but I think you can see how it's important that you be at work at time, and people in Ted's job have a different situation because of the urgency of the work or whatever the situation might be. So you don't discuss Ted's particular performance, but you can discuss Ted's job, his position. And in the performance appraisal, then, especially if you realize that Sally is sensitized to the fact that she's being evaluated for her punctuality when others aren't, is to include a line, something like, because Sally is the receptionist, it's very important she be at work at time to greet customers who may be coming in just as the business opens. So explain and justify it if you're not being consistent about attendance and punctuality requirements. Judgment is another area. Obviously, this is usually going to be pretty subjective, but when you see examples of poor judgment, again, you're going to have recorded those in that calendar system that you have, and you're going to be able to say, well, I talked to Bob about the fact that, for example, he took that client to lunch, but that client almost generates no sales for us. And they went to a fancy restaurant and I got a expense report for $200. Whereas Bob didn't take to lunch Louise, even though she generates a lot more sales for us. That would be an example of poor judgment. It shouldn't be a surprise to Bob. The examples that you use when you're writing Bob's appraisal should be ones that you've already talked to Bob about, at least the vast majority of them. Maybe something's happened last week or two that you haven't talked to him about that you're including. But anything that's ancient history, say more than 2 weeks old, you don't save it up. You don't note, oh, Bob made a mistake there, but I'm not going to tell Bob. I'm going to save it up for his appraisal. Well, if you don't tell Bob, how is Bob going to make the changes that you want him to make? You don't want him to wait to make the changes until the performance appraisal. That means you're going to have X number more weeks of bad judgment. And so there should, again, be no surprises here. And if you can show how the bad judgments resulted in a loss to the company, that's awesome. Then it becomes much more quantifiable, because Bob, Bob took, Larry to lunch for $200, and yet over the last 6 months, Larry hasn't purchased any additional product from us. Therefore, that $200 investment did not result in any sales. That was an example of poor judgment. So if you can make it economic or going to any business judgment issue, then that's a positive way of making it somewhat objective. Ability to work with others in a team. This is almost always going to be an important aspect of the appraisal, being a good coworker. That's useful to document. And again, this can be when there are tensions in the workplace. That should be a source of a comment. Sally isn't getting along with George. George isn't getting along with Patrick. It's important in this situation not to just say, well, you're both to blame. Many times both are to blame, but sometimes one person is more to blame for another. I've had work situations. I remember one, this was many, many years ago, where I had an individual who had an alternative lifestyle that made another person who didn't have an alternative lifestyle uncomfortable. And the two of them didn't argue about the lifestyle situation, but they would quarrel amongst each other about various and sundry issues. In some sense, you might say, well, they were both to blame, and I suppose they were kind of both to blame. But to me, it was obvious that the person who did not have an alternative lifestyle situation was really the one who was provoking the situation. I would say 80% of the blame for it went to person A, and maybe 20% were person B. And while the alternative lifestyle was not a legally protected category, as the law was understood at the time, it was negatively impacting the workplace. And so in that situation, the person who's primarily responsible for the situation ought to be the one who's being addressed. And you shouldn't then say, well, they're both guilty. Probably they're both a little bit guilty, but especially when you have a protected characteristic that may be in play, you have to be sure that you are making sure that that's not the real source of tension between individuals. And again, it can be unconsciously the source of tension between the individuals. Did the person who found, we'll say Larry was the person who was picking fights with Bob. Bob had an alternative lifestyle. I don't think Larry thought that it was because of Bob's lifestyle. He just found Bob annoying. Bob kind of got under his skin. But my opinion was that the reason that Larry found Bob annoying was on some level because of Bob's lifestyle situation. So those things can be important to tease out when you're looking at the ability to work with others in a team. And we have the responsibility to work with everyone in a team, even those we don't care for, even those we don't respect. Leadership. And I like to add followership here too, because everyone needs to be willing to take on leadership responsibilities sometimes, but everyone also needs to take on followership responsibilities. When my child was 2 years old, one of my children was 2 years old, they had a great teacher, really, really awesome teacher. And I was talking, his name was Joe, and I was talking to Mr. Joe one day, and I said, how do you do it? And he goes, you know what? I have, he had a co-teacher, but I think he had 20 children, 18 or 20 children in the class, I can't remember there, but anyway, a lot of kids. And he goes, and each one of them developmentally thinks of themselves as the center of the universe. They think the whole world revolves around them. That's a developmentally appropriate for them. That's what they should be doing at this time in their lives. And I know that, and I get that, and I'm able to manage through that. So they each think of themselves as a leader. And when they're 2 years old, that's okay. But if you have 20 people working for you and they each think they ought to be in charge, that's a recipe for disaster. If you have 20 people reporting to you, most of the time, those workers need to be followers. They need to be doing what they're told. Implementers is another word to consider using this area. Yes, you may ask them to lead this meeting. You may ask them to lead this project. You may ask them to lead by example in some other respects, but at the end of the day, most of the time, their role is going to be following the guidance that you have. And so being good followers is oftentimes going to be more important than being a good leader. But certainly leadership is an important quality as well. Employers are free to establish whatever criteria they want. Of course, the more they're connected to the economic goals of the business, the more logical they are, the more easy they are going to be to defend to a jury. Obviously, one challenge can arise with disabled employees. You know, if you have as a goal that this person has to do X at a certain speed, but because of their disability, that's difficult for that person to do, there may be the need to make certain adjustments. And so you have to take into account the needs of that disabled individual. Exempting that category of folks, though, from the list, you should apply the same criteria pretty much uniformly across the workforce. You want to be consistent in applying those standards. And you want to be as objective as possible. You want to look at the data to see. You won't want to just trust your gut, because again, we all have implicit biases that we may not even be consciously aware of, that we think, oh, well, that person's super good at that. And so we need to be constantly challenging ourselves in those areas and looking at well, you know, I have a gut feeling that Bob is doing this right and this wrong, but let me actually look at the data and see, is my gut feeling right? And of course, the criteria that we're using has to be job related. We shouldn't be measuring things that aren't helping the performance of the goal of that particular department. Now, employers can and should hold disabled employees to the same standard of performance as all other employees, but the fact that an employee needs a reasonable accommodation, and this could be a disability or a religious accommodation, shouldn't negatively impact their appraisal in any way. So you can't say, well, you cost me $5,000 because I had to buy or have that new ramp installed or whatever to get your wheelchair into this place. So, you know, you start out with a black mark against you in the appraisal process. If a disabled person is unable to perform a marginal function of the job, in other words, a non-essential function of the job, then that employer should remove that function from the job and certainly not consider that in a negative light in the performance appraisal. This shouldn't even be a factor to be considered. So it should not be reflected in the performance ratings. And if for that particular employee, it should even be removed as one of his or her goals. So at this time, I'm going to end this lecture. Again, if you have any questions about the topics that we discussed today, please feel free to pop into my office hours. I'm always delighted to discuss this topic with you. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.